A flight attendant slapped a black man in first class, then accused him of lying. But what she didn't know? He was a federal judge. One phone call later, she was fired before the plane even landed. You're about to see how power, prejudice, and karma collided at 30,000 feet. Before we dive into this unbelievable story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a true tale that shocks, inspires, and keeps you thinking. This is Telltales, and trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The flight from Atlanta to Chicago seemed like any other. Passengers moved through the jet bridge, bags were stowed, seatbelts clicked, and the plane eased into the clouds, cruising smoothly at 30,000 feet. In seat 2A sat Judge Raymond Carter, a well-known African-American federal judge with a spotless reputation and a presence that exuded quiet authority. Wearing a tailored gray suit and a pair of gold-rimmed reading glasses, he was the kind of man who blended humility with power, someone more interested in his work than the spotlight. As other passengers relaxed with movies or dozed off, Carter reviewed legal documents, preparing for a keynote address at a major legal conference the next morning. Everything about him suggested composure, dignity, and restraint. First class, service began soon after takeoff, and Melissa, a blonde flight attendant in her mid-30s, started moving down the aisle. She greeted passengers with a practiced smile, clearly trying to maintain poise, though a flicker of tension suggested she might have had a rough day. She approached Judge Carter and offered him a drink and a snack, which he accepted with gratitude. He finished his orange juice quietly while continuing to annotate a file, then politely requested another. It should have been routine, a simple transaction, but instead, it became the moment everything unraveled. Melissa returned holding the juice but said in a clipped tone, "You already had two. I can't give you another." Her words hung in the air like a challenge. Carter, confused but calm, responded with care, "I believe this is only my second one. If it's a problem, I understand." His voice was even, without a hint of confrontation. But something in his gentle correction ignited something deeper in Melissa. Her face hardened, eyes narrowing as she took a step closer. "Are you calling me a liar?" she demanded, her voice rising slightly. The nearby passengers began to glance over, sensing a change in the cabin atmosphere. Judge Carter, still in his seat, still composed, answered, "No, I'm just saying there might be a misunderstanding." But he barely got the sentence out. Before it happened, Melissa's hand flashed across his face in a sudden, unprovoked slap. The sound cracked through the quiet cabin like a gunshot. Heads turned, mouths dropped open, gasps erupted as the shock of what just happened settled in. For a moment, no one moved. Phones came up as passengers began recording. Eyes widened in disbelief. Had a flight attendant just assaulted a sitting federal judge, unprovoked, in front of a full cabin? Judge Carter sat frozen for a moment, then calmly lifted his hand to his cheek, wiped it gently, and turned to look Melissa in the eyes. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. He didn't rise from his seat. He simply said, with measured weight, "That was a mistake." And though the slap had been loud, the silence that followed was louder. Passengers began murmuring. Some stood up. A woman across the aisle said loudly, "I saw everything. He was polite the whole time." Another man added, "I'm recording. This is insane." Yet Melissa, caught in her own storm, didn't back down. "He's being aggressive," she shouted, her voice now panicked. "He's threatening me." She turned to another flight attendant for backup, but the expression on their face said it all. They had seen what really happened. Still, Melissa pushed forward, hoping to rewrite the scene with volume instead of truth. But what she didn't know was that truth was already being documented, from 6 different phones, from 6 different angles, and witnessed by people who weren't going to stay silent. This incident, which started with a second orange juice, was about to become a national headline. And Judge Carter, the man she tried to frame, wasn't just another passenger. He was a man whose word held weight, whose calm under fire would only strengthen his case. What happened next? Stay tuned for the next section. And again, if you're hooked already, and we know you are, make sure you subscribe to Telltales for more unbelievable true stories that reveal the power of truth, even at 30,000 feet. Of course, here is your full engaging 1,500-word story, crafted from your prompt, told in one continuous paragraph for storytelling on YouTube, with clear cinematic pacing and dramatic tension, Melissa shouted, "You disrespected me. Don't lie to my face." Her voice cracked with fury, and the words sliced through the cabin like a blade. But instead of chaos erupting, a stunned, icy silence followed. Passengers who had been half asleep or casually scrolling through their phones froze mid-movement. The man she was screaming at, Judge Raymond Carter, sat still, his expression unreadable, his posture perfectly straight in seat 2A. He didn't yell back. He didn't throw accusations. Instead, he slowly raised his hand, wiped his cheek where the sting of Melissa's slap still burned, and looked her straight in the eyes. "That was a mistake," he said, his tone low but heavy with meaning. Around them, passengers began murmuring. A woman across the aisle immediately stood up, pointing in Melissa's direction. "I saw everything. He was nothing but polite to you," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. A man a few rows back fumbled with his phone and hit record. Another muttered, "This is assault." The shift in the air was immediate. Support for Melissa evaporated, and her initial confidence seemed to drain from her face as she looked around, realizing she had just crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Still, instead of admitting her mistake or backing down, she doubled down, perhaps out of panic, perhaps out of instinct. "He's being aggressive," she barked at another attendant, who had approached. "I feel threatened." But her claim was met with incredulous stares. Judge Carter hadn't moved from his seat. His hands were still resting calmly on his lap. His voice hadn't risen by a single decibel. There was no aggression, only quiet authority. The other flight attendant, a younger woman clearly uncomfortable, looked from Melissa to the judge and then back again, unsure of what to say. "Ma'am," she said cautiously, "he hasn't done anything." And that was the truth. Judge Carter had done absolutely nothing but speak politely and ask for clarification when Melissa wrongly accused him of requesting more than 2 drinks. But now he'd been physically assaulted and publicly accused of aggression, all while sitting in first class with nothing but legal notes and an empty orange juice glass in front of him. Slowly, he reached into his blazer, pulled out his phone, and stood up. "Excuse me," he said, addressing no one in particular. "I need to make a call." Melissa instinctively stepped forward, almost as if to block him, but he raised a hand gently and said, "I wouldn't do that if I were you." There was no threat in his tone, only a kind of calm certainty that made her stop in her tracks. He walked toward the galley where the crew prepped drinks, away from the eyes of most passengers but within earshot of a few. The call lasted just under 2 minutes. Though his voice remained even, one sentence stood out as it echoed through the narrow aisle. "Yes, this is Judge Raymond Carter. I've just been physically assaulted by a flight attendant, and I'm requesting this be formally documented with your executive team." When he returned to his seat, there was no drama, no smugness, just the return of that unshakable calm. Meanwhile, whispers spread like wildfire among the passengers. Phones were already uploading footage to social media. One man whispered, "He said judge, like a real judge?" Another responded, "I think he's someone serious, like government level." Melissa, now seated at the rear jump seat, clutched her hands together and stared at the floor. Her co-workers were avoiding her gaze. The captain received a direct message through the secure airline communication channel. "Confirm identity of passenger 2A. Cooperate fully. Flagged for immediate investigation upon landing." From that moment on, the energy in the cabin shifted entirely. Passengers who had witnessed the assault were buzzing with disbelief and outrage. A woman leaned over to Judge Carter and offered him a bottled water, whispering, "You handled that with so much grace. I don't think I could have stayed that calm." He gave a slight smile and replied, "Sometimes dignity is more powerful than rage." And that's exactly what carried him through the rest of the flight. No retaliation, no drama, just quiet. Judge Carter reached into his suit jacket, calmly took out his phone and said with steady composure, "Excuse me, I need to make a call." No panic in his voice, no tremble in his hand, just the quiet, chilling certainty of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and what it meant. He rose from seat 2A, leaving behind the stunned silence of the first-class cabin, and walked toward the galley where the cockpit crew had a clear view. One of the other attendants, clearly unsure of what was going on but sensing the seriousness, stepped forward as if to intervene. "Sir, maybe you should stay seated," she said nervously. But Judge Carter turned slightly and looked her directly in the eyes. "You'll want to let me make this call," he said. And she did. He dialed. The cabin was quiet, but the tension was thick, and the passengers were now fully alert, many of them still holding their phones, either recording or texting about what had just happened. The call lasted under 2 minutes, but it might as well have stopped time. Passengers who sat near the galley overheard just one line, but it was enough. "Yes, this is Judge Raymond Carter. I've just been physically assaulted by a member of your cabin crew." That single sentence, spoken with such restraint and gravity, carried more weight than shouting ever could. Melissa, the flight attendant who had slapped him just minutes earlier and then falsely accused him of being aggressive, stood frozen. Her arms, which had gestured so wildly before, now hung stiff at her sides. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes darted from passenger to passenger, aware now that nearly everyone was watching her, and not with sympathy. Her defiance, once loud and forceful, dissolved into a brittle silence. Something had shifted, and she felt it in the pit of her stomach. Judge Carter returned to his seat, adjusting his blazer and calmly retrieving his legal documents. He didn't announce what he had done. He didn't raise his voice. He simply resumed reading, as though the slap and the accusation hadn't just happened, as though the eyes of the cabin weren't all locked on him. But the passengers knew. They had seen it. They had heard her tone. And now, they had heard him make that call. One by one, murmurs spread. "He's a judge?" someone whispered. "Federal," another replied. "She really slapped a federal judge?" A third asked, almost in disbelief. A woman across the aisle shook her head. "She's finished. No way she walks away from this." The atmosphere on the plane had changed. The captain had already been alerted via secure channel that a high-profile incident had occurred and that a federal judge was involved. A note was relayed from the ground team. "Hold flight at gate. Prepare for law enforcement." Melissa paced quietly at the back of the cabin now, her previous energy drained. She no longer looked like the woman who had barked accusations across the aisle just minutes before. Her co-workers had distanced themselves, unsure what to say or how to help. None of them could deny what they'd seen or what was captured on passengers' phones. Judge Carter had been calm, polite, and respectful. Melissa had escalated the situation and struck him, then tried to flip the narrative. But the truth had already taken flight. As the flight continued its descent into Chicago, passengers leaned over to Judge Carter, offering quiet words of support. "I'm so sorry you went through that," one woman said. "You were the calmest person in the room." He nodded with a small smile. "I've been through worse. But thank you." Another man in the row behind offered, "If you need a witness statement, I've got it all recorded." Carter replied, "I appreciate that, truly." As the plane touched down at O'Hare International, instead of heading straight to the jet bridge, it was met on the tarmac by airline security and airport law enforcement. Uniformed officers boarded first. An airline official followed close, behind. The lead officer approached Melissa and asked her to come forward. "We'd like to have a word with you, ma'am," he said. She hesitated, looking around the cabin as if searching for a lifeline. No one met her eyes. No one spoke up for her. She was escorted off the plane, her badge taken, her name noted. She didn't resist, but her face told the story. The arrogance was gone. Judge Carter was asked to remain seated for a brief moment. The captain approached and personally apologized. "Sir, on behalf of the crew, I want to say how sorry we are. This should never have happened." Carter nodded, gracious, but firm. "I appreciate that, Captain. I trust your team will handle the follow-up." He was escorted off next, not like a VIP, but like a man whose calm had earned everyone's respect. By the time he reached the gate, news of the incident was already spreading online. A passenger's video had gone viral on Twitter and TikTok. The slap. the accusation, the judge's quiet words. It all played like a scene from a legal drama, but it was real, and it was damning. One tweet read, "Flight attendant slapped a black federal judge and lied about him being aggressive. He made one call. She's gone." Another, "This man just taught a masterclass in how to handle injustice with poise." By evening, the airline had released a public statement. "We are aware of a serious incident aboard Flight 729 from Atlanta to Chicago, involving a member of our cabin crew. We are conducting a full investigation and have placed the crew member on immediate leave pending review. We have reached out directly to the passenger involved to offer our full cooperation and apology." But the damage had been done. Melissa was terminated within 48 hours after internal review revealed multiple passenger complaints in her record, some previously unaddressed. Judge Carter, meanwhile, was contacted by senior airline executives, federal transportation officials, and multiple news outlets. He declined all interviews, offering only a single written statement. What happened aboard Flight 729 was not about a drink, or a seat, or a personal vendetta. It was about accountability, perception, and the dangerous consequences of false accusations. I commend the passengers who stood up for the truth and the professionalism of the crew. Within minutes of the altercation, the flight deck received a message from airline headquarters. Full cooperation required with passenger in seat 2A. Immediate investigation ordered upon landing. The urgency in the message was unmistakable. But it wasn't just about protocol. It was about the weight of the situation and the reality that a respected federal judge had just been assaulted in front of a cabin full of passengers. As the plane flew on toward Chicago, Melissa, once brimming with confidence and anger, was now pale and silent, sitting in the jump seat near the rear of the aircraft, her uniform now looking a little disheveled. The other flight attendants, who had observed the outburst and the slap, immediately took over her duties, and no one could avoid the uncomfortable silence that hung in the air. The once energetic and defensive woman, who had tried to label Judge Carter as aggressive, now seemed to shrink into the seat, her face drained of color as she glanced out the window, perhaps realizing the magnitude of what had just transpired. Meanwhile, the passengers, who had been uneasy at first, were now fully engaged in the reality of the moment. They had seen the slap, heard the false accusations, and watched as Judge Carter remained composed, responding not with anger but with quiet authority. Whispers spread throughout the cabin, the murmur of disbelief only growing. Some passengers exchanged glances, nodding toward the front of the plane where the judge sat, calm and unflustered. Others leaned forward, offering supportive words. "That was insane. You handled it like a pro," one man in the aisle seat whispered, his voice tinged with both admiration and disbelief. Judge Carter simply nodded in acknowledgement, but his reply was simple, reflective of his calm demeanor. "The truth always comes out." That phrase, so quietly spoken but so profoundly meaningful, hung in the air. It was a reminder that no matter how loud the lies were, no matter how aggressively someone tried to twist the narrative, truth had its own way of cutting through the noise. And that truth was now being recorded not just in the memories of the passengers who had witnessed the assault, but also in the videos that had already gone viral across social media. But what Melissa didn't yet realize was that her actions had been captured in multiple ways. The assault hadn't just been caught on camera by a handful of passengers, it had been witnessed by no fewer than 6 passengers who were now willing to testify to the truth of what had happened. These were people who had been sitting in close proximity to Judge Carter, their eyes trained on the exchange as it escalated from a simple misunderstanding to an outright physical assault. Each one of them had seen the exact same thing, the flight attendant Melissa striking Judge Carter without provocation and then turning the blame onto him. And each of them, once they realized the weight of the situation, knew they had to speak up. Their phones, some still recording, had captured the pivotal moment. The slap, the words, the stunned silence that followed. They hadn't just been passive observers, they were witnesses to an injustice. They knew they had the power to ensure the truth was not buried under a pile of false accusations, and it wasn't just about standing up for the judge, it was about standing up for what was right. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. Where there had once been nervous energy, there was now a quiet, collective understanding. The passengers who had initially felt uncomfortable watching the confrontation were now emboldened. There were no more whispered doubts. There were no more wondering if the judge had indeed provoked Melissa. Everyone who had seen it knew the truth. They knew that he hadn't raised his voice, hadn't shown any signs of aggression. He had simply asked for clarification when he was wrongly accused of having more than 2 drinks, and for that, he had been slapped. And then, he had been falsely labeled as aggressive. It was that moment that fueled the shift in energy. It was as if everyone on board had silently decided that no one would let Melissa get away with her actions. The truth had taken flight, and it was impossible to ignore. Even as Melissa sat in silence, her colleagues avoiding eye contact with her, she must have felt the gravity of what was happening. The passengers were no longer just silent witnesses. They were now the ones who would ensure that the truth was upheld. At that moment, Melissa's defiance seemed to evaporate into the stale air of the cabin. She had underestimated the power of truth, the power of witnesses, and the power of a man who, despite everything, had stayed calm and dignified. By the time the plane began its descent into Chicago, the shift in the cabin was complete. Everyone knew what had happened. The passengers who had recorded the incident had already sent the footage to their friends, family, and social media, spreading the word fast. Melissa's actions were no longer her own private mistake. They were a public matter now. The truth, as Judge Carter had said, always comes out. And as the plane touched down at O'Hare, the consequences of Melissa's actions became unavoidable. The airline had already received word from the flight deck, and their legal team had been alerted. Judge Carter, having made his call earlier, had left no room for doubt. The airline officials who met the plane on the tarmac knew what had happened, and they were prepared. Melissa was escorted off the plane first, her badge removed, her uniform slightly askew, her eyes avoiding the stares of the passengers who had witnessed her actions. The crew, who had once been so hesitant to confront the situation, were now quietly performing their duties, leaving her to face the consequences of what she had done. Judge Carter was asked to remain briefly on the plane, and while he could have easily chosen to make a dramatic statement, he didn't. He remained composed, waiting for the investigation to unfold. As he stepped off the plane, his briefcase in hand, his expression was calm, but his presence commanded respect. He had already said all that needed to be said, and now the investigation would take its course. The truth would prevail, as it always did. Melissa's fate was sealed the moment the plane landed. Within hours, the airline had issued a statement of apology, and her name was removed from the roster of active crew members. The footage from the flight had gone viral, shared and reshared across platforms, and by the following morning the headlines were everywhere. Flight attendant fired after assaulting federal judge was just one of the many variations that appeared on news outlets. Social media exploded, with people commenting on how Judge Carter had maintained his composure and how the witnesses had rallied to ensure that the truth was not buried. Civil rights organizations praised the actions of the passengers who had stepped up to hold Melissa accountable, pointing out that this wasn't just a case of a flight attendant losing her job. It was about the larger issue of false accusations and the need to treat every individual with respect, regardless of their race or status. As for Judge Carter, he declined to speak further about the incident publicly. His quiet dignity had already spoken volumes. He'd let the truth take flight, and it had done so with undeniable clarity. The flight had landed, but the story was far from over. As the wheels of Flight 4821 screeched onto the runway at O'Hare International, a hush fell over the cabin, not from the usual landing jitters, but from the weight of what had just occurred at 30,000 feet. Passengers peered out the windows and gasped as they spotted flashing lights and uniformed officers waiting at the gate. News had traveled ahead of the plane. A senior airline representative and multiple law enforcement officers stood by with solemn expressions, prepared to act swiftly. As soon as the aircraft came to a full stop and the seatbelt sign clicked off, 2 police officers stepped on board, with quiet authority. They walked directly to the first-class cabin and approached Melissa, whose face had gone pale. Her once defiant posture had melted into silence. She didn't resist, didn't argue, didn't speak. The passengers watched as her ID badge and airline credentials were collected without a word, her gaze fixed downward. She was escorted off the plane first, not in handcuffs, but with the gravity of consequence thick in the air. Passengers whispered, recorded, and exchanged knowing glances. This wasn't just about a slap, it was about justice, truth, and the dignity of a man who refused to be provoked. Judge Carter remained seated until the crowd thinned. He quietly spoke with airline officials and police, providing a calm, concise account of the incident. He made it clear that he would not press criminal charges, but he did request a full investigation by both the airline and the FAA. His statement wasn't driven by vengeance, it was driven by principle. A wrong had been committed, and silence was not an option. Within hours, video clips from multiple passengers began to circulate on social media. Each one showed the same story, a composed, respectful man being accused falsely and assaulted without provocation. But even more damning was the cabin surveillance footage that corroborated every second of the incident. No raised voice, no threats. Just a quiet conversation twisted by Melissa's aggression. As the videos gained traction online, news outlets quickly picked up the story. Local and national headlines ran with variations of the same theme. Flight attendant slaps federal judge mid-air. False accusation backfires in first class. And slap in the skies sparks national outrage. The public response was swift and fierce. Comment sections, talk shows, and news panels erupted with conversations about race, power, and professionalism. People weren't just reacting to the slap, they were responding to how quickly an innocent man, especially a black man in a position of power, could be villainized in a situation where he'd done nothing wrong. Civil rights advocates weighed in, noting how easily the narrative could have gone another way had there been no witnesses or recordings. The story became a flashpoint for broader conversations: the danger of weaponizing false claims, the importance of due process, and the reality that not everyone in a uniform is worthy of the power it symbolizes. The airline, caught in a PR storm, moved fast. In less than 24 hours, a formal statement was released. "We do not tolerate any form of abuse, discrimination, or unprofessional behavior from our staff. The flight attendant involved in the incident on Flight 4821 has been dismissed effective, immediately. We extend our sincerest apologies to Judge Raymond Carter and to all passengers impacted by this unacceptable conduct." The airline's CEO also reached out personally to Judge Carter with an apology, offering private transportation, hotel accommodations, and a commitment to review staff training procedures. But Judge Carter, ever poised, declined the luxury perks. What mattered to him was accountability, not comfort. The fallout for Melissa was swift. Her name, once unknown to the world, trended for the worst reasons. She was placed under internal investigation not only for the slap, but for prior reports of inappropriate behavior that had been ignored or dismissed as stress-related. It turned out this wasn't the first time she'd acted out, just the first time it was caught so clearly and irrefutably. Former colleagues began to speak out anonymously, describing previous altercations where she had been confrontational or dishonest. While none of those incidents had escalated to violence, a picture began to emerge of someone struggling with authority, control, and boundaries. But this time, the consequences weren't going away. Online petitions circulated, demanding permanent revocation of her license to fly. Her social media accounts were shut down. She disappeared from public view entirely. Meanwhile, Judge Carter returned to his normal life, but not unchanged. At the legal conference he had flown in to attend, he took the stage not with his prepared remarks, but with an off-the-cuff message about accountability. In front of hundreds of lawyers, scholars, and students, he said, "This wasn't about orange juice. This wasn't about a seat in first class. It was about integrity, about not letting fear or rage rewrite the truth. I didn't ask for what happened on that flight, but I refused to let it be swept away." His words were met with a standing ovation. Clips of the speech circulated just as widely as the in-flight videos. People didn't just see a judge, they saw a man who modeled grace in the face of injustice, who reminded the world that true power doesn't need to shout. In time, the buzz around the story faded as all viral moments do. But the lessons lingered. Airlines updated training, passengers felt emboldened to speak up, and a quiet man in a gray suit became for many a symbol of restraint, truth, and strength. This wasn't just another headline. It was a moment where the system worked, where the innocent were believed, and where actions had consequences. And for everyone who watched it unfold, whether on that plane or through a screen, it was a powerful reminder that justice doesn't always need a courtroom. Sometimes it lands at Gate 12, quiet and undeniable. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more true stories that shock, inspire, and remind us that truth always finds its wings. Only here on Telltales. Within 24 hours, the fallout was swift and decisive. Melissa's employment with the airline was officially terminated. The airline, facing mounting public pressure and reputational damage, released a clear, firm statement. We do not tolerate any form of abuse, discrimination, or unprofessional behavior from our staff. The flight attendant involved in the incident on Flight 4821 has been dismissed. We extend our deepest apologies to Judge Carter and all passengers affected. That announcement ignited a wildfire across media platforms. News networks ran the story with dramatic headlines. Federal judge assaulted in mid-air. Flight turns turbulent after first-class confrontation. And most notably, slapped the wrong judge. That particular phrase, blunt and unforgiving, began trending on X, formerly Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram within hours. Memes surfaced, commentary exploded, and everyone, from late-night hosts to civil rights leaders, weighed in on what had become not just a viral moment, but a cultural conversation. Judge Carter's stoic response, captured in multiple phone videos, was shared millions of times. Clips of him simply wiping his cheek, remaining seated and saying, "That was a mistake," were paired with captions like, "Real power doesn't need to shout," and "Grace under fire." What stood out even more than the act itself was the judge's calm refusal to escalate the situation, even when falsely accused of aggression. Many internet users remarked that, had he reacted with just a fraction of the anger most would consider justified, the narrative might have been dangerously flipped. Civil rights organizations quickly joined the conversation, pointing out the broader implications. It wasn't just about a slap. It was about how easily a black man, no matter how accomplished, can be falsely labeled as threatening. Prominent voices warned that if there had been no witnesses, no phones recording, no title like federal judge attached to his name, the outcome could have been very different. The story prompted public reflection on the long history of false accusations against black men and the very real consequences that often follow. Activists emphasized how crucial it was that truth prevailed this time, not just for Judge Carter, but for everyone who's ever been unfairly accused and lacked the visibility or power to defend themselves. At the same time, support poured in from all corners. Legal professionals, judges, former airline staff, and the general public applauded the judge's conduct. One widely shared post read, "Judge Carter didn't just protect his own dignity, he set a new standard for how injustice should be answered." Videos of his conference speech the next day, where he abandoned his prepared remarks and spoke from the heart, drew massive viewership. "This isn't about orange juice," he said to a packed auditorium. "It's about accountability. It's about integrity. It's about being calm even when it would be easier to explode." The applause was deafening. Students and attendants said they felt like they were witnessing a lesson in ethics more powerful than anything in their textbooks. Meanwhile, the airline scrambled to contain the damage. Internal documents later leaked showed that Melissa had previously been the subject of at least 3 internal complaints, none violent, but all concerning her tone, temperament, and treatment of passengers. Those incidents had been swept under the rug as high-stress responses, but now, under scrutiny, they were being reevaluated as early warning signs. Former coworkers began speaking out anonymously, describing her as volatile, often taking offense where none was intended, and quick to escalate minor misunderstandings. It became clear that what happened on Flight 4821 wasn't a one-time outburst, but the culmination of behavior long ignored. Calls for reform within the airline industry soon followed. Former flight attendants spoke up about how understaffing, Inadequate training and unchecked authority could combine to create dangerous environments, not just for passengers but for crew members too. Training modules were re-examined. Union reps demanded better mental health screenings. Whistleblowers felt newly empowered. Even rival airlines used the moment to tout their professionalism and retraining commitments. As for Melissa, she vanished from the public eye entirely. Her name, once unknown, became toxic in online spaces. Attempts to defend her behavior were swiftly drowned out by overwhelming evidence, including high-definition cabin footage showing the SLAP, her accusatory lies, and the subsequent confrontation. Online sleuths even uncovered now deleted posts from her personal accounts that suggested a pattern of disdain for difficult passengers, language that suddenly took on a more disturbing tone in hindsight. In contrast, Judge Carter's star only rose higher. Not because he sought attention, quite the opposite. He avoided interviews, declined requests for book deals, and resisted efforts to make him the face of any campaign. But the quiet strength he displayed, the way he handled injustice without retaliation, struck a deep chord with millions. His story was featured in magazines, ethics classes, and even diversity seminars. He became an unintentional symbol of modern dignity. Behind closed doors, he continued his work, presiding over cases, mentoring young lawyers, and leading judicial panels. But every now and then, when someone recognized him in a courthouse elevator or at a coffee shop, they would thank him, not just for being a judge but for showing how to hold power responsibly. The ripples of that flight spread far beyond the runway. Airline companies met with federal officials to discuss passenger rights and employee conduct. Training modules on implicit bias were updated. Whistleblower hotlines saw increased usage. Perhaps most significantly, a renewed public discussion unfolded about the harm caused by weaponizing false narratives. At its heart, this wasn't a story about aviation. It was about the high cost of a lie, the courage of staying calm under fire, and the quiet power of being right when the world is watching. Judge Carter never needed to raise his voice. He never needed to press charges. All he needed to do was stand his ground, make a phone call, and let the truth take flight. And in doing so, he reminded us that in a world quick to react and even quicker to judge, sometimes the strongest move is the calmest one. So the next time you board a flight, or walk into a room, or face a situation where tension rises, remember this story. Because it's not about being powerful, it's about using your power wisely. And that, in the end, is what separates those who command respect from those who simply demand it. If stories like this resonate with you, stories that speak truth, stir emotion, and shine light on real moments of justice, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and tap the bell icon so you never miss an episode. This is Telltales, where the truth always finds its way through the clouds. In a world where so many incidents are swept under the rug, where people in power often act with impunity, and those without it suffer quietly, Judge Raymond Carter stood as a reminder that integrity still matters, and so does accountability. When he addressed the public just days after the now infamous incident aboard Flight 4821, his words weren't wrapped in outrage or legal jargon. They were simple, clear, and powerful. This wasn't just about me. It was about accountability. No one, no matter their uniform, position, or stress level, has the right to put hands on someone else or weaponize false accusations. I'm grateful the truth was seen and heard. That statement, short and steady, rippled through the media and online platforms just like the incident itself. It wasn't just a judge speaking. It was a man who chose dignity over drama, truth over retaliation. Melissa, on the other hand, had vanished. After her termination, there was no apology, no explanation, no social media defense. She was gone, deleted. Profiles, no public appearances, no statements. But her silence spoke volumes. The airline's internal investigation, which had initially been brushed off as routine, uncovered a deeper pattern. Several former passengers came forward quietly, reporting past encounters where Melissa had overreacted, snapped, or treated passengers with hostility. Some said they didn't report it at the time, thinking it was just a bad day or the pressures of the job. But now, looking back, they realized those were warning signs, signs that were ignored until it was too late. And while those earlier moments didn't make headlines, they created a trail of tension that led to the slap heard around the internet. The deeper lesson, though, went beyond Melissa's actions, or even the airline's failure to address them earlier. What this story really forced everyone to confront was how quickly things can escalate when assumptions are made, when race, status, and power collide 30,000 feet above the ground. It could have gone differently. If there had been no cameras, no witnesses willing to speak, if the man in seat 2A hadn't been a judge but just another passenger, who knows how far the narrative would have spun. We've seen that story before. The aggressive passenger label slapped on people who don't fit a certain mold, and who often don't get the benefit of the doubt. But this time the cameras rolled. The passenger spoke up, and the truth, undeniable and documented, cut through every lie. Judge Carter didn't press charges. He didn't demand headlines or sue the airline. What he did demand, and what he received, was a commitment to fairness and truth. For many, that quiet strength was the most inspiring part. Civil rights groups began using his story in campaigns about racial profiling and workplace accountability. Law schools dissected the event in ethics discussions, and the phrase "justice flew first class" became more than a clever tagline. It became a symbol of how truth, when handled with composure and clarity, can travel further than any scream or fight. But perhaps the most lasting impact was on the public's awareness. This story wasn't about a celebrity meltdown or political scandal. It was about a regular moment that turned extraordinary because someone chose restraint in the face of disrespect, and then let justice follow its course. People shared the story not just because it shocked them, but because it reminded them of what fairness looks like in action. It made folks reconsider how quickly they judge others, how dangerous assumptions can be, and how important it is to speak up when something's wrong, even if you're just another passenger in row 4 with a camera phone. Parents used it to teach their kids about self-control. Schools talked about it in current events classes. It wasn't just viral, it was vital. And somewhere in all of this, Melissa's silence remained. Perhaps she reflected. Perhaps not. The world may never know. But one thing became clear. Uniforms don't grant immunity. Authority doesn't mean you're always right. And the smallest moments, an orange juice request, a misplaced accusation, a slap, can ignite conversations that stretch far beyond the walls of a plane. In the end, Judge Carter returned to his courtroom, his bench, his books, and his quiet dedication to justice. But the skies had shifted. Airlines took another look at how they trained their crews, not just in service, but in sensitivity. Discussions began around new policies for passenger complaints and onboard incidents. Some airlines even piloted new de-escalation programs for their staff, inspired in part by what happened that day in the clouds. So what can we all take from this? Maybe it's that we don't always get to choose what happens to us, but we do get to choose how we respond. Judge Carter didn't shout, didn't retaliate, didn't play to the cameras. He stood up, literally, and metaphorically, and made one calm, measured call that changed everything. A call not for vengeance, but for truth. And that call, backed by grace and supported by evidence, echoed louder than any outburst ever could. Because real justice doesn't need to roar. Sometimes it just needs to speak clearly. And in this case, that truth didn't need a courtroom. It flew first class, landed with impact, and reminded all of us that how we treat others, especially when no one's watching, matters more than we think. So if this story moved you, if it made you pause, reflect, or just shake your head in disbelief, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Here at Telltales, we bring you true stories that make you feel something. Stories where the truth rises above the noise, where justice lands, and where character still counts. Because the next story might just be the one you never knew you needed to hear. Let this story be a powerful reminder. Never judge someone by their appearance, and never assume that power is reserved for those in uniforms. And most importantly, never, ever slap someone mid-air, thinking there won't be consequences, especially if that someone has the power to bring the truth to light with a single phone call. If you found this story shocking, eye-opening, or inspiring, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more real-life stories that challenge your perspective and make you think. This has been Telltales, where the truth always takes flight.